Decades before rock stars embraced the Gulfstream V, there was the Starship, a former United Airlines Boeing 720. Refurbished in the early 1970s by teen heartthrob Bobby Sherman and his manager Ward Sylvester. It was an airborne pleasure dome. The plane plied the skies in the service of, among others, Led Zeppelin, the Rolling Stones, Deep Purple, the Allman Brothers, the Bee Gees, Elton John, Peter Frampton, and Alice Cooper. Sherman and Sylvester invested $200,000 to reduce its seating capacity to 40. The plane was kitted out with everything that a 70s rock star could want. The Starship brimmed with gaudy chic delights. There was a bedroom with a king-sized waterbed, a drawing room with a fake fireplace, a 30-foot brass-trimmed bar with built-in electric organ, a prehistoric video system stocked with everything from Deep Throat to duck soup, and 2 stewardesses to cater to the velvet-trousered minstrels fresh from their Madison Square Garden gigs. Led Zeppelin were the first band to lease the plane in 1973. Zeppelin used the aircraft for their 1973 and 1975 North American concert tours. In 1973, Led Zeppelin was suffering from some bad press. Rolling Stone suggested the band change its name to Limp Blimp. It was thought that the Starship might earn the group some respect. It was an extremely useful tool because inviting a journalist onto the plane, the story wrote itself, said Danny Goldberg, Led Zeppelin's publicist for the tour. He had been hired to create a positive coverage, the novelty value was significant, he said. The tour was divided into 2 legs, with performances commencing on the 4th of May and concluding on the 29th of July 1973. Led Zeppelin would travel on the Starship. Initially, they'd flown on a Falcon jet. But it was small and was often hit by air turbulence. So, for $30,000, the Starship was given a paint job. The exterior was resprayed with Led Zeppelin emblazoned down the side of the fuselage. They used to park themselves in big city hotels, New York, LA, Chicago, Dallas, and then fly in and out of the smaller cities and back that same night, ferried to and fro between hotels, airports and concert halls, via a squadron of limousines. The Starship was even staffed by 2 stewardesses, Susie, an attractive 18-year-old blonde, and Bianca, a 22-year-old with a dark complexion and a sense of humor. Inside, the main cabin contained seats and tables. Also revolving armchairs and a 30-foot-long couch, which ran along the right-hand side of the plane, and opposite was the bar. The Starship also featured an electronic organ built into the bar itself. At the rear of the craft, there were 2 back rooms. One with a low couch and pillows on the floor, and the other, a bedroom, complete with a white fur bedspread and shower room. Here's a photo of Zeppelin manager Peter Grant on the fur bedspread. So what was life like aboard the Starship? The first time the Allman Brothers boarded, they were greeted with "Welcome Allman Brothers," rendered in lines of cocaine on the clubroom bar. Zeppelin's Robert Plant once commented that his favorite memory of the plane was oral sex during turbulence. And Goldberg says the band's fearsome manager, Peter Grant, would disappear with girls in tow to the luxurious bedroom and not reappear until the end of the flight. Despite the heedless indulgences, the wife of an Atlantic Records executive recalls Led Zeppelin's manager Peter Grant brandishing a handgun on a flight to Pittsburgh while the entourage hoovered cocaine. The Starship came to symbolize the isolation of what rock stars of the 70s embraced as they saw less and less of everyday life. Danny Marcus, a former Atlantic Records executive, marveled that after a Zeppelin concert in Minneapolis, with the audience thundering for more, The band had already been whisked aboard the Starship. I'm being served lobster thermometer as we're going down the runway, and the audience in the building is waiting for the encore. The Starship had it all. Even President Nixon's Air Force One, at the time, didn't compare. Most of the Starship's nouveau riche rockers thought that the plane was the ultra of decadence and luxury. And for the times, it probably was. A 4-engine variant of the Boeing 707 renovated at a cost of $200,000, the Starship leased for a staggering $2,500 per flight hour and was a potent symbol of rock and roll primacy. It was definitely a show of where you were in your career, said the now 70-year-old Peter Frampton, whose management leased the plane during his Frampton Comes Alive tour. It was a statement of how well you were doing. It was pretty much a party plane. We'd drive onto the runway. Just a long stream of black limos, jump out and get on. Frampton dimly recalls crashing in the master suite, but mainly we propped up the bar. To foil customs inspectors who boarded with drug-sniffing dogs, Frampton says the entourage's contraband was stashed in the dirty stage clothes bag. So that was our attempt at stealth. David Libbert, Cooper's road manager, declared it a rock and roll Air Force One. The deepening sexual revolution of the early 70s allowed for a freewheeling carnality. On the Alice Cooper tour, manager Libbert used the plane's PA to announce the daily ball scores, which was a naming account of the previous evening's sexual indiscretions. Libbert says that Alice warned him one morning, "I do not want to be in your goddamn ball scores, I'd better not hear my name." So Libbert announced. The high for last night was, "I'm afraid I cannot mention his name though." Then added, "I'll give you a hint though. He is a very big star." Susie Carnell, who was one of the flight attendants aboard the Starship, remembers John Bonham once tried to open the airplane's door over Kansas City because he wanted to pee. John Paul Jones, the band's bassist and keyboardist, acted as the piano man, entertaining the revolving cast of hangers-on with pub songs like "I've Got a Lovely Bunch of Coconuts" and other pub classic songs. At the time, they were the biggest band in the world and they celebrated in standard fashion. They painted their name across the fuselage, snorted cocaine with rolled-up hundreds, and treated the master suite like a pay-by-the-hour motel. In Cole's words, the jet became a floating gin palace. The tour went off without a hitch. And though the Starship cost a king's ransom to lease, the group even managed to cut expenses, albeit in their own inimitable way. In those days, Cole recalls, "We went through a phase where we only drank 64 and 66 Dom Perignon. If we found a good deal, we'd have one of the assistants buy several cases and store it on the plane." Led Zeppelin became indelibly associated with the Starship when the band posed with the plane in Bob Gruen's iconic 1973 portrait. The picture, Gruen tells Billboard, sums up the excess and decadence of the 70s, the fact that here are these guys, they don't even have to button their shirts, and they have their own plane. The photo has been a touchstone for rock and roll aspirants ever since. If you were operating at the top echelon of the record business, you had to have the Starship, says the legendary rock photographer Neil Preston, who held an all-access boarding pass for Led Zeppelin's tours. "It was the Bolivian diamond flake of airplanes," he said. But the Starship's immense popularity was fueled as much by function as by fashion. The plane revolutionized the way bands toured. The whole point of the Starship was mobility, says the Led Zeppelin biographer Stephen Davis, who was invited aboard during the band's 1975 tour. No more staying overnight in towns like Kansas City where they roll up the sidewalks at 10 o'clock at night. Throughout Zeppelin's 1975 US tour, the Starship was painted red and blue, with white stars, similar to the United States flag, and with a smaller Led Zeppelin logo on the fuselage. According to Peter Grant, at one point during this tour, Zeppelin drummer John Bonham sat in the co-pilot seat and assisted in flying the plane all the way from New York to Los Angeles. We mentioned that Led Zeppelin were the first band to lease the famous Starship plane. But other bands also leased it for their own tours. The list of artists and tours that the Starship was used for are as follows. English rock band Deep Purple hired the Starship for their 1974 US tours. They can be seen arriving in the jet with the band's name emblazoned on the side in the DVD for the California Jam Rock Festival, entitled Live in California 74. Ian Pace of Deep Purple fondly remembers being in Miami and, on a whim, flying to Boston for a lobster dinner. It was a time when everything was doable, he says, and we weren't shy about spending the money. In an interview with Circus magazine in 1974, Deep Purple's John Lord explained, "It's a 707 put together by a firm in LA that Sinatra, Dylan and his band just used and Elton John uses. It has a lounge, a bedroom, a shower and a study. It's supposed to look as little like a plane as possible." On tour with the Allman Brothers, Bob Gruen, the band photographer, recalls a band member, of whom he can't remember, walking out of the hotel in his bathrobe. He then got into his limo, which stopped at the steps to the plane, where he then could walk onto the plane and go back to the bedroom to go back to sleep. As nomadic musicians can attest, there is no greater comfort than traveling on your own schedule, however erratic. On the Starship, there was no baggage claim, no autograph seekers or security check. Though Jagger found the jet's motif too Vegas, his first words upon boarding were, "It's so tacky." But most passengers thought it was quite stylish. For the Stones, there was an added bonus. When the group leased the plane for their 1975 tour, it solved the long-standing problem of Keith Richards' tardiness. The often comatose guitarist could now be propped up, wheeled onto the tarmac and tossed aboard the plane, where Susie would be waiting with his favorite drink, a tequila sunrise. Peter Frampton was the last to charter the Starship in 1976. As early as Alice Cooper's 1974 tour, the aircraft was beginning to show signs of engine difficulties. And by the time of Led Zeppelin's 1977 US tour, it was permanently grounded at Long Beach Airport. The band was forced to find a comparable alternative. And tour manager Richard Cole eventually chartered Caesar's Chariot, a 45-seat Boeing 707 owned by the Caesars Palace Hotel in Las Vegas. The Starship went through several ownership changes from 1977 through to 1979 until it went into storage at Luton Airport. It was dismantled for parts starting in July 1982. Greg Allman summed up the 70s era in his 2012 memoir. Everything was over the top and uncalled for. And just flat out unnecessary. We had a guy whose only job was to open limo doors for us, he wrote. When the Allman brothers got that goddamn plane. It was the beginning of the end.